let's do a quick look here. See, developer Maxis still closed. Most of their developers have moved on and don't even work for EA anymore. Yeah, in comes City Skylines, a game that enacted the Blackjack and Others rules. Developer Colossal Order decided that SimCity would not die with 4 and made their own. Skylines plays very similar to SimCity 4 and the older titles, such as a lot of details and features that were removed in the newest game 2013, but make a return in Skylines. Now for starters, Skylines is a decent looking game. It's the first thing you'll notice. But it's not the most attractive, warm, inviting. The art direction took sort of a muted take, for lack of a better term, on the colors. And the resolution of the actual texture work is not super high. However, I would imagine this might have been just to essentially not run out of video memory in general, because there's a lot of things on screen happening. But it does give the game an overall relatively bland look. Like, for example, there's color here and there, but it almost all has a little bit of a pale look to it. More visual indication and feedback would have been great, like, say, for example, brighter greens and stuff like that in really nice areas, or darker nights or darker days in areas that are polluted. More visual indication of pollution on air and ground, like dirty roads, dirty grass, for example. This all would have been a good way to really add character. The day-night cycle added is relatively cool. The lighting is really nice and it looks great, but it doesn't really impact gameplay a whole lot. I mean, that's fine, it just doesn't. Later on in the game, when skyscrapers begin propping up, they all look almost identical to each other with very few colors. However, this might actually be pretty realistic and relatively accurate to real life, as most metropolitan areas are very similar to each other. SimCity 4 didn't have this issue, however, and definitely neither did SimCity 2013. Maybe it's the nostalgia goggles on SimCity 4. Hard to say, it's been a little while, but SimCity 2013, it had a lot more color and art built into it. A little bit more warm, inviting colors, but too bad the rest of the game wasn't. Now, the soundtrack, or lack thereof, it's there, okay? It's not bad, it really isn't. There's a lot of very quality orchestra music and whatnot, but it all just sounds stock. It sounds like stock music for a movie, almost. SimCity, for example, even the newest one, had excellent music. A lot of music that people still listen to today. Say, for example, if you go to SimCity 4's soundtrack on YouTube right now, there are people commenting in the comments section below that they play Skylines, turn off the music, and they listen to SimCity 4's music. Take a listen and see for yourself. Between the soundtrack and the graphics, Skylines comes off, honestly, as a little bit of an uninspired game, oddly stating. It just lacks that character. Like, Simcity had the wacky advisors, strikes, stuff like that. The news ticker that would run at the bottom of the screen not only had funny or sometimes interesting things, but also actually useful information from time to time. Like, for example, when you were running out of power, it would alert you to your silly little advisor who's flipping tables in the background because, oh my god, we don't have electricity. Whereas in Skylines, it's like a Twitter bot called Chirper. Has a really annoying sound effect, by the way. Why is it so loud by default? It gives almost never any useful information in the slightest. Most of the time it's just filler. The sound mixing in Skylines can be a little off sometimes as well, must say. Very rarely a sound effect will play that shouldn't have, for example. Hard to say it. Only really seems to happen when you're pretty far in, like relatively late into a city, and I've only experienced it a few times. And not really a big deal. Most of the time it's alright. Most of the time it's completely as you would expect. Now the meat and potatoes part. The part that everyone loves. The gameplay. The best part. Skylines plays very similarly to the older SimCity titles like SimCity 4 and 3000. This is a great thing. Also, by play similarly, I mean it's basically the same. This is fine. A lot of people are more than glad to have that. Anyways, for those unfamiliar, there is 3 different zones that you plant. You build the roads and whatnot, and then you zone them: residential, commercial, industrial. Demand will change from time to time depending on what demand there is. Basically, you zone for what they ask for, they go to the area, and they build within the zone areas. Actually works pretty similarly to how it works in real life. Skylines does this right. When you build a road, it creates a zonable location alongside it. Depending on the available space or the type of road or the ground can dictate how much of the area is zonable. For example, hills or water will prevent it, and wider roads will shift the tiles a little bit outward away from the road by 1 or 2 tiles. The only issue I have is SimCity 4 would create inside roads for you by default, which was a really nice touch. But I've learned very quickly that intersections are not your friend. More on that later. Skylines assumes that you would make these intersections manually, and sometimes they're right. However, sometimes zoning in Skylines is a little broken. SimCity, what it did was it would break down demand into different subcategories like office demand, retail demand, high density, low density, industrial offices, whereas Skylines just blankets them all into one group, and sometimes the demand just bugs out and goes to zero for all three. Maybe I'm building too fast and the travel time it takes them to get there is the problem, but I don't know. It shouldn't be almost zero. Each of these zones will also require services to operate. They all require power, water, sewage, garbage, police, fire, leisure in the form of parks and plazas, and a newly added service of death care. Residential will also require healthcare for the living and education. Now, one thing that sucks about education, SimCity 4 had like bigger schools that had more desks, more chairs, whereas Skylines doesn't have this factory. So you basically will have like elementary schools every city block because there's just not enough desks. This isn't actually how it's done. Most of the time they just make the building bigger. But I'm sure there's mods that'll fix this. Anyways, these two services are required for residential on top of the previously mentioned. Some additional options will become later available to the residential zones or in general. Elder care, child care becomes available, but it's completely pointless. And campus zones as well. They basically don't change the gameplay dynamic whatsoever, as in most cases just spamming clinics for healthcare or like 3 hospitals will pretty much get you there, and elementary and high schools, just spamming those is almost always better and adequate to achieve a pretty high level of education for the city. It doesn't really need to go that far. Anyways, commercial zone requires a little bit extra police coverage since retail stores and whatnot create additional crime, and industrial prefers a little bit extra fire coverage since their buildings are more dirty, more prone to fire. Now, supplying power and water is back to the old style. Placing power lines and pipes is back. However, the zones don't supply power coverage like other titles did. Only the buildings in the zone, once they're built, do. Weird. So getting a new large expansion or an entire new region going can be really irritating because you basically have to break your zones that you just placed with power lines, and then once the buildings are built, you have to remember to go back, break the power lines, replace the zone, and then wait for them to essentially knock down if they used a really small building and rebuild all together. It's kind of dumb. The zones should just give power. However, it's a lot better than the way that SimCity 2013 handled it. They did power and water through these little worker agents that were supplied on the road. They would go out from wherever the distribution building was, power plant, water pump, etc., and they would travel down the road to the building. Now, it kind of makes sense that you would have the power lines run along the roads, because in reality, that's actually how most of them work, outside of really high-end transmission lines. But the agent system was really stupid, and it barely worked. It was essentially just a car that would drive to the location with terrible AI, whereas in Skylines, it just works, minus the, building has to be built in the zone to create a grid. Now, one of the major issues I have with Skylines is the lack of automatic intersections. Say, for example, in SimCity 4, if you dragged a road over a road or a pipe over a pipe, it would automatically create you an intersection. But in Skylines, it doesn't. Bridges require you to manually measure their supports to be sure it doesn't end up on a road. Same thing with the power lines. You have to space them out manually. Why? SimCity 4 didn't have this problem. Neither did even 2013. It automatically would move them for you. There was also no neighboring cities. Nobody to do deals with or anything. Another spot where they really could have added character and dynamic. Dynamic not as much important, there's still a good amount there, but, having a wacky neighbor would have been cool. Now, on the other side of requiring manual action, transit is all manual. This is great, because in SimCity 2013, bus stops would just create invisible lines with no effect. where City Skylines allows you to design your lines. Careful thought of where people are going or where they're coming from. You can actually use this in your favor to make effective transit that people actually use. Speaking of mass transit, there's a lot. Trams, buses for roads, trains, monorails, subways, blimps, boats, taxis. There's so many to choose from. Personally, I use the subways and the trams, since neither put cars on the road. I do have issues where cars will pile up behind buses because the bus takes a while to load and the driver pathfinding seems kind of basic. It's either following one of many pre-generated routes or a relatively quick and dirty one. Now, that being said, I totally understand why this would happen. I can't imagine doing real-time pathfinding or even complex pathfinding at the point of start on 40,000 cars wouldn't just find a CPU and light it on fire. Now, on the subject of traffic, it certainly becomes challenging as you go. Even with tons of transit options, you really gotta think out your methodology of what types of transits you want to provide, since in some cases, they actually overlap. Say for example, trams and buses, they basically serve the same purpose. So why would you have both? A lot of the times you'll have a completely full tram because they just picked everyone up, and a completely empty bus on the road. You just gotta be careful. Randomly, cars will stick to a lane for no reason. They'll change lanes at the absolute last second like a jackass. But I believe the lane changes are done in chunks, since the traffic mod allows you to see them, and I'm assuming the pathfinding is done at these chunks, and that's why the cars will wait to the last second to do it. However, actual researchers in Sweden use the Skylines traffic AI to simulate traffic flow and patterns in a real-life scenario. Also, there's a lot of really terrible or incompetent drivers in real life, so maybe this is an accurate representation. And having real, perfect AI would actually be inaccurate. Either way, I'm no road artiste, I'm more of a spaghetti chef with a lot of underground layers. It does work, if you were wondering. My biggest difficulty with roads is highway terminations. On-off ramp sections I really struggle with. Plenty of times I've referred to Google Maps of my actual region and other cities. I'm not an engineer, I've learned, and this is well beyond my capability of understanding why that guy won't turn right. Later on, the game slows down a little bit performance-wise. Frame rate slows down. Even a pretty good computer will have this problem. But that being said, the sheer amount of pathfinding that's going on, I imagine, makes a C programmer cringe. Industry itself creates a lot of traffic. Freight going in and out of the city. They basically need their own highway. Because now, on top of that, you have people going and coming from work. Options are available though. You can use boats or trains to get the freight out or get the freight in. However, the train stations and the boats come on a tiny little 2-lane road that you can't upgrade. And they both create an absurd amount of traffic both ways. So what you'll have is a 6-lane road bottlenecked down to a 2-lane road, and everyone's trying to turn left. Moving on, Skylines has a lot of DLC, and almost none of it is worth it at the full price. Several add 1 or 2 things here and there, like not much value for the dollar. For example, After Dark was pretty much a day-night cycle, and Industries felt more like a mod or a subcontracted DLC that slightly expanded the industry system, but for the most part was pretty much the same industry system that was already there. Other DLCs are literally just a radio station that you could have just played on a YouTube video in your background. Snowfall's pretty cool. It adds cold weather and heat demand. By default, they'll use electricity to heat their homes and businesses, which very greatly increases the power demand. Imagine that. And you, of course, can upgrade your underground pipes that have heaters built into them, but it is insanely expensive. And of course, they need a heating building that's really expensive to go along with it. Pretty much, the snow maps are financial hard mode. The campus DLC is almost completely pointless since you basically don't need it, as the aforementioned spam them and you're good to go. And Sunset Harbor adds a fishing industry and like one style of buses. For $15? Give me a break. Now, Skylines can regularly be had on sale during the Steam sales events, if you're willing to wait. It's DLCs as well, but personally, while I believe the base game is worth the asking price plenty, the DLCs come across as a little bit of a dirty business practice-y. They barely add pretty much any content for the dollar, and they really don't seem like they should have been sold separately. Meanwhile, the main game comes with a huge amount of maps, and all of them have massively unlockable areas that you can build in. They start out with, almost on purpose it seems, the same starting size as the entirety maps of SimCity 2013 has. But they open up to about 24 times that pretty quickly. Some of the mods even allow you to unlock all 24. Other mods allow you to unlock 81. It's a little buggy, but you can. On top of that, there's mods. Skylines has workshop support, adding in a lot of gap fillers and sections of the game. 2013 didn't have that, as well as maps that even further devalue the DLC, as a lot of the maps added in the DLC are really not as important, seeing as there's a lot of really quality map work on the workshop if you're willing to, filter through a little bit. Now, all that said and done, I do enjoy Skylines quite a bit. I've got like 220 hours of the game. It'd be silly to say don't buy it. I think it's actually quite a good, well-made game. I'm just not a fan of the DLCs. I've picked up a few of them on sale, and, the game itself is very well worth what they're asking for it at its base price. It's a little bit of a steal on sale. The amount of content and gameplay you get it really covers the price. If you really want more, I guess, pick up the DLCs. But, one of the things I couldn't help but notice, the comments on those SimCity 4 and SimCity 3000 soundtrack videos, they were saying to listen to those soundtracks and play the game. They were absolutely right. It's the perfect mix. Skylines and SimCity 4's music.